this. I'm Jeff Smith. Thanks for being here. This is Democracy Nerd. We just entered the second year, the 12-month mark of the COVID pandemic in the United States. And for the past year, we have heard the clamor for when we will return to normal. That said, the last year has exposed some uncomfortable realities of that normal. Maybe we should be talking about a new possible. To talk about that new possible, Professor Philip Clayton, Willamette University, Claremont School of Theology, also, and I'm going to read it so I get it right, the president for the Institute for Ecological Civilization, the co-editor of the New Possible Visions of Our World Beyond Crisis. Professor, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me on the show, Jefferson.
So I set it up as I did. Feel free to push back or to push forward. I will say, as a hobby horse of mine, when I have heard people say, well, let's get back to normal, I'm like, sheesh, I hope we can do better than that. What is your reaction when you hear that, let's get back to normal?
That we would be missing an incredible opportunity to begin thinking about the way we live with each other, whether in our governance, in our economics, or just in the makeup of our communities. And for us to give up on this opportunity and to head back to something that was comfortable, but just isn't working, would be a tragic mistake.
What are the biggest missed opportunities? We may go through a laundry list, but obviously during this year, there has been significant discussion around racial justice, around racial violence, significant discussion, but not as emotionally pointed about the state of sort of the planet and ecology and the environment and our opportunities there. What's on your mind? What are those big missed opportunities that you hope won't get missed?
Yeah. In terms of the focus on democracy of your program, I put it this way, that democracy is like a mountain range with many smaller ridges. And what we've seen over the last year, dominated as 2020 was by COVID, is huge uprisings in awareness of anti-Black racism in the United States, uprisings related to economic injustices that became more and more pronounced over these last months, and uprisings about the kind of system that keeps us plowing forward toward a climate crisis without reducing the accelerator, taking our foot off the gas, literally, and beginning to find a more controlled way. Some of those will be ridges that we leave behind, but the overall thrust or movement or momentum of the last year, that's what we can't lose. And to say, let's go back to the normal, is to say, let's unlearn what we've just learned through a year of, frankly, a hell of a lot of suffering.
So that provides maybe certainly a common thread across this work, which, to be clear, is not a book by you, but 27 essays by folks that you convened. How did this project come together?
Mm-hmm. We'd been working with Justin Rosenstein, who is a Google and Facebook person and who founded Asana.com, speaking about a different kind of goal for humanity than the one that has dominated over the last literally hundreds of years. When COVID hit and when the Black Lives Matter movement began to catch public attention in the way that racial issues had not caught public attention, say, possibly since the Civil Rights era, we said this is the time to bring together voices and to speak not of the return to the old normal, but of a genuine, permanent turn toward the new possible. And that became the birth of this book on visions of our world beyond crisis.
As you start thinking about perspectives, you engage this question, you're having conversations with others around this question, how do we, to use the now cliche of how not to waste a crisis, you start wrestling with this idea. How do you kind of curate the disciplines, the perspectives that are going to be included, right? Now is the time for greater power for blank. Not all those perspectives are going to align or agree. How do you curate that?
Yeah, so that was actually a matter of great debate. We did this really quickly. We wanted to get the essays out to the public while COVID was still there and while the chance for more permanent change was still present. And we had lots of scenarios and models for constructing the book. In the end, we chose words that we thought the American public would link to. So all of the essays fall under the headings Earth, us, change, and then specific areas: wealth, work, food, education. And then we closed with love, community, and tomorrow. And it's obvious that each of those words speaks to something, existential in the human condition. And with those words, the essayists didn't get into technical details or losing us in vague and theoretical language. It retained a kind of earthiness. I mean, what is more fundamental to human existence, but also human culture and community, than food? So food brought together these different theorists from their different perspectives to speak to the human condition, I think, in a core, grounded way. And if the book has a tug on readers, and it seems to do, it's because of that grounding.
So if the exercise of theology is head almost literally in the clouds, and if the exercise of Michael Pollan is feet and maybe even hands, and it's sometimes even face on the ground, if you can do both things, you're a very tall person. And and I guess in this process, what surprised you? What was not merely a manifestation of the propaganda you wanted to deliver, which is essentially, hey, everybody, don't forget to change some things, but also educated you, changed how you think about things?
I'll just be really blunt. I mean, I've done a couple dozen books in the past, so doing a book is not new.
Congratulations, by the way. I don't know if that's a humble brag or just a straight up brag, but it's very impressive.
It's a statement so that to be in the middle of a book is something I've spent a lot of my life doing. This one, constantly against the temptation toward cynicism, despair, hopelessness. And, we often ask ourselves, and some of the authors asked us in the conversations, is COVID an opening to something new? Is Black Lives Matter an opening to something new? Or are we just stuck in an eternal cycle of recurrence that we will literally go over the cliff of climate crisis with the gas pedal of society on full, of human consumption and human selfishness on full? Can we change the system? And to be honest, that was something we wrestled with. And what I saw happen as the authors began to see the model essays and then do the first and second and third draft of their own is that people found and held on tenaciously to the hope itself. And I think you find, as you even skim through the chapters, that they exude a common sense, like this: guys, we can do this. The opportunity is there. We see it more clearly than we've seen it for a long time. It's April 2020. The streets of Los Angeles are mostly empty. People are bicycling with their families on an afternoon. People are at home with their kids whom they haven't talked to for years. And something is different. We don't want to lose this thing. Locally sourced vegetables are being sold at our supermarket. Do you remember that? What didn't happen before because the shipments weren't coming in from Africa. And that, I think, was the exciting thing that happened in the book. It grew a kind of momentum. And the reception that we've had, I think, shows that people feel that hope. They feel, yes, we can do this differently.
There are a couple of examples that come immediately to mind because even from my perch, I've been able to see progress. So what all of us have seen is the hastening demise of the in-person, or at least decline, of the in-person retail shopping center, right, on its way, and then all of a sudden, right, the ascendancy of the attention economy, the ascendancy of purchase by click rather than driving. We see, although somebody still has to drive to deliver it to me, to be clear, so we definitely saw that. I also had the chance, somewhat relatedly, to watch my brothers. My brother's a school teacher, and over these past days have been parent-teacher conferences. And parent-teacher conferences, the teachers get 3 days off, which means also students don't have class, don't have that rhythm, don't have that, can forget, right? Add the weekend to that, they're getting almost a week of lack of instruction in a row, and organized that way because that was the only way to do parent-teacher conferences, right? You got to have them at the building, you got to have them in that room. Parents need to have it on their schedule to arrive. They need to drive there, show up, park, get in, wait in line. If at least wait for the previous set of parents to parents or guardians to exit, and then go and do that same thing. And he's like, now I can text parents. I didn't have that before. Now I could do regular check-ins with parents. If we could change the habits within schools, I could every month I could do 15 minutes with parents. Say, here, I could send them videos on, hey, here's what we're, 30-second videos, 1-minute videos. Here's what I'm expecting from your kids. Here's how you could help. And I could have and he deals in a population that includes many second language English learners, that include most of the parents of his students have not attended college. So empowering parents who want to be very useful, right? They want to be helpful, but they didn't have that modeling for themselves all the time. That he's seeing a significant opportunity for change. Also, we also do work in clinical research, and the habits around clinical research studies are now seeing accelerated changes. So that stuff is good. Let's stick with good news. Any other places? I'm not going to prepare to say every piece of what I just said is good, but there's a lot of good there. What are some good news? What not only opportunity, but progress you are seeing?
Yeah. We could take particular sectors. The tech sector is one that probably we want to focus in on. It's one of the hardest to change, but it's also one of the most rapidly changing. We've seen the way, for example, that commercial factors drive our major social media sites. We think of social media designed as a way we connect with each other. During the election cycle, we saw social media as a place where echo chambers could let a small group of people think that the whole democracy was built around their core ideas and no other ideas made it in through the ears. We think of the question of clicks. Every click, as the Tristan Harris, one author in the book, said in a major Netflix hit, The Social Dilemma, every click is a way to make money for the social media company. But for me as a user, or for my twin 18-year-old boys sitting in the other room on social media right now, every click is what they think a way to make a connection with a friend or a girl, or to like a movement or a product or a song that they care about. Do you see how in the tech industry, there are these two different things that can be happening? Your positive examples of connecting through Zoom in ways that weren't possible before, and then the negative examples of profit-driven forums that we think are human connection, but are actually much more driven by the dollar as the bottom line.
I'm reminded of somebody we haven't talked to yet, but I'm reminded of the author of Bowling Alone, and the sort of early work saying, hey, we're being disconnected as a nation, and then Mark Zuckerberg steps in and says, okay, well, we won't have bowling leagues, but what we'll have is an ability to have online relationships. And now, of course, the ascendant wealth in the world is based on extracting capital from those interchanges of connection, belonging, and attention. You got any hopes there? So I asked for good news, and you gave good news and bad news.
Yep.
Any hopes you have for how our relationship with technology improves? Not only how technology improves our lives, but our relationship with technology might improve?
Yeah, I can give a really clear answer to that question, I think. For any particular sector you look at, you're going to get the good news and the bad news. In tech, in agriculture, in education, in banking, in economy, and so forth. When you can take those areas where there's conflicting forces, the profit-driven, dehumanizing, and the human-centric, if you can bring it down to those base levels where humans actually exist, and recognize what it is that we need existentially. So what do we need? We need community, family, a community that we live in, broader civic organizations or religious organizations. We need safety. We need the basic levels of human survival, of Maslow's hierarchy, to be met. And then we need that sense of fulfillment, something that we do that matters deeply. And finally, we need to be able to live in a way with the planet, with the other biosystems that allow us to survive and thrive over the long term. And what the new possible really does is to focus attention back down to that most fundamental level, the level on which everything else is based. When we get our thinking clear there, then let's rebuild upward in ways that don't destroy the very foundation that we live on.
I think I'm just stealing this, but the new economics of human technology, including shift to a post-growth attention economy that prioritizes mental health and well-being, diversity and stakeholders who can build accountability for long-term social impact, how to change the basis of competition towards mutuality and cooperation. So this is, we're ever going to hear is not, it sounds like not merely a change in consumer or user habits, but a change in the social contract, which would include but not be limited to presumably large-scale policy changes, unless you think all of it happens because of unwritten contracts and all of us just sort of change how we move through the world each day. Maybe it's a different question. Maybe I'll repeat the question. Any signs that some of that behavior change is happening, and or any policy proposals that now seem more obviously needed, or around which there's more opportunity?
Mm-hmm. So I love the way you set up the question, Jefferson. First, that's what I want to say, that when we have these foundational level human needs recognized, and we're not going to let them be compromised as we move up, then we don't move immediately to particular experiments. What we do is we formulate policies. Policies are broad statements of intention or guidelines for keeping the things that we value the most and not losing track of them. We do that in Oregon state government, and we try to do that at the national level. So when we've passed the Farm Bill every 4 years, the $1 trillion spending collection, the idea is to have policies to guide the way we do agriculture and food in the United States, as we do also at the state level. And it's that point where I really would like to focus the discussion, because it's not enough to just say, let's form a food pantry here in Salem, or let's do this, change the number of hours our kids have access to social media. Let's talk about the ways we'd like to structure our society as a whole, sector by sector, so that those fundamental human values that bind us together don't get lost.
All right, well, let's take food, and let's go deeper on food, and maybe that'll even drift into sort of economy and ecology. It's hard for me to get out of my mind even housing, right? So that we see now a growing desire, or a sort of re-amplified desire of people wanting more space that is theirs. Well, good news is maybe I don't have to drive to the office. Good or bad news is I still want my space, or I still want to be able to. I want to have a porch that is mine, that I can go out, that might even have a little heater on it, and people can come over and stay 6 feet away from me. But I want my outdoor space that's mine. How do you see? But let's stick not just environment broadly, but with food. What are some of those changes you think are most obviously necessary? Maybe that have been just sitting under our noses and now there's a chance, or something that hadn't occurred to very many people prior.
Mm-hmm. The very first step as we move from those fundamental things that all Americans want, all human beings want, the fundamental step is to take on the very conflict that you just named. And you started in the right place. And that is, does the individual say, I have an unlimited right to everything that I can afford to buy, and that is the bottom line of all my decisions? Or, as we put it in the heading of the book, us, is it that we need to figure out how to live in community at the local level, almost at the hyper local level, the smaller community within our cities that we're a part of? And if we can say that humans living in community, humans finding fulfillment and sustainability through community, then we can find agreement on approaching agricultural policy. So, for example, we want to be able to have, say in Oregon, it's a great example, local farms where we're able to produce food, as much food as we can for our state, and not be completely reliant on a global economy that brings at huge environmental costs um, really luxury goods from around the world. To what extent can we as communities in Oregon find a way to meet our own food needs? How can we support Oregon farmers? How can we support local agriculture? Whether those are larger, more commercial farms or smaller specialty farms like small wineries or others. To me, that's a great example of getting the values right, the community values right at the very beginning. And then we scale from there. If we don't get that foundation right, then I'm afraid we're in the position where we're not changing the system. We're going back to the old normal.
So let's stick with foundation for a moment. It does occur to me that over the last 13 years, the two major United States crises, and that saying "the" is unfair. Let's say the two major economic crises, sort of writ large, and two of the crises we faced, but those that seem newsworthy because they, as distinct from economic degradation or environmental degradation, and distinct from racial injustice, they are not only events and activities that human beings face every single day, right? So there's some novelty to them. But anyway, so two big economic crisis, housing crisis, mortgage crisis, 2008, 2012, and now the pandemic. And if I'm from a remove, and I'm not a propagandist for a particular news outlet or a particular sort of political entity, I'd say, well, that first one was an example of what happens if you have unfettered greed applied to the housing market. And now we have a global crisis about which cooperation is necessary for salvation, right? That if I only think about what I am doing, or I don't even set aside, I'll flip it. I know that I'm impacted significantly by the conduct of other people, right? If other people are wearing their mask, if other people are social distancing, I am less likely to catch something. If I do likewise, I'm less likely to spread it. But it demonstrates that interconnectedness. Sort of in high relief, both of those examples different from, let's say, sort of an Ayn Randian take of like worry about yourself and everything else is just going to sort of work out. Does that combination provide, although we are in a very different media landscape, right? Like now there is there are propaganda mechanisms. We talked, I think, episode 19. We talked to Yochai Benkler. His book was, still is, Network Propaganda, that talked about sort of feedback loops that can be hard to escape. That even if there is a new reality with major new facts, people can maintain, kind of cognitive consonance, address cognitive dissonance with their own identity set points by by just kind of staying in their little filter bubble. To cite another, somebody we haven't talked to yet is Eli Pariser. So, but still, outside of that, it seems like there is now this opportunity to, or maybe necessity to reset our understanding of how each of us relates to community because of watershed events that have happened over the last 12 years. Am I being a Pollyanna? Are you seeing it similarly? What am I missing, or where am I too optimistic?
Exactly the same way. So if I just had one expression to sort of guide us as we move into the various practical areas of decision-making and policy, it would be the phrase communities of communities of communities. That we see ourselves as a community-based species, just as the Earth's biosphere is a community-based system of interlocking ecosystems, each one filled with interlocking organisms and natural resources. So if we could see that, then as we move into any particular area, we'd have a sort of guidance. So let's take banking. If we set up banking so that global commercial entities which produce money by issuing debt run our financial interactions driven by the buying of debt and maximizing expenditure, then, and the willingness to spend a lot of our life paying interest to these banks, which are so they can make the money, then that will undercut community. There are cases like the North Dakota State Bank, or what credit unions used to be, or local community banks, where the funding is to make possible for a person to purchase a home or purchase a piece of property or agricultural land or something like that. If we see the economic structures, let's just take the local bank, as supporting the thriving of community in our small Oregon town or our medium-sized city, then we've built the foundations right. And from there, we can build an economic system based on making capital available to people to thrive with each other, to have a healthy community, and to thrive with the land around them. And I would want to do the same thing for each of the other areas that we might want to explore in our conversation.
Again, returning to foundation, it is not lost on me that the foundation of your discipline, and therefore of this conversation, is theology, right? Is the essential questions of why, not merely essential questions of how. How do you, I could have said why, but how do you thread sort of the theological discipline through pretty food, right? Like, let there be light. This doesn't say exactly how that light shall appear. It is done by edict. How do you wrestle with that, or am I just too confused because it is so terribly obvious?
It isn't. I should say that the book was written for me wearing the hat of the president of the Institute for Ecological Civilization. So those are what drives that is the question of what is a sustainable long-term existence of human beings on this planet look like. So there's nothing theological in my role as editor of this particular book. But what is the connection? And I guess I would say not theology in the sense of some truth imposed from above. In fact, that would contradict the way that you and I have been speaking through this whole discussion, but rather theology as a study of what human beings have believed religiously around the world and across human history. There are many authors represented in the book who have a religious position. So there's a Catholic speaking of the Pope's environmental encyclical, Laudato Si. There's a famous Buddhist teacher, Jack Kornfield, and others. But the religious group most represented in this book are indigenous peoples. 5 or 6 chapters are written drawing from the wisdom of native peoples around the world. And that kind of theology is one that is consonant with the discussion that you and I have been having. It's the focus on the relationship of a group of humans to the land and to their core value beliefs. I mean, Plains natives in the United States did have a belief of a highest sort of a sky god, a highest source of value, but it was always a god who would support the ways of living sustainably on the land and with each other. And that's true of most indigenous peoples around the world. That's an understanding of theology that I think we need to learn from. And maybe those of us who represent Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions need to do a little bit more listening and then look maybe more deeply at our own traditions to see how they might promote harmony between human beings, diversity of human beings, and connection with the earth.
So, if not a perfect, at least a useful segue, one of the posits is of the importance of shared story.
Yeah.
You can speak better than I to why and how there is importance to shared story, but also where might we find it? I mean, do we find it among indigenous peoples? Is that and if so, what are sort of those narrative threads amidst that shared story that might help us weave something that approaching a shared tapestry? Talk to us about shared story.
Yeah, I like that a lot. The closing author in the book is David Korten, founder of Yes Magazine, and author of a 2015 book, I think it was, Change the Story, Change the Future. David Korten has argued that we're setting up our economic and our governance systems around a story that's now outmoded, a story of westward ho expansion, of the divine right of Europeans to conquer this unfortunately inhabited continent that they came to. And it's a very different story to tell, for example, the story of an ecological civilization that is a way of humans organizing cultures that's built toward the long-term well-being of people and planet. Um, and the only other thing I would want to say about story is that I believe that stories are best told hyper locally.
Hmm.
When you think of the medicine man or the oldest woman of the tribe in a traditional African or Polynesian tribe, and there would be the festivities and the eating and the dancing. At the end of the evening, the children would sit around the fire, and the wisdom keeper would tell the story of the tribe. Who are we? What are our values? What do we live for? And sure, there would be gods and there'd be a creation story and so forth, but it always was focused down on this community, what bonds us together to live well with each other. And I would love to see us learn to tell again the stories of our particular communities. In the Pacific Northwest, that's a privilege to tell of the land that we live on and its beauty and its history. And then as we move outward, let that be a guide to, what can we say, the grand narratives, say that Christians or Jews tell about creation and redemption and,
Hmm.
final hope. If that could be guided a little bit more by the quality of living together, by the value of compassion, I do think we'd live a lot better with each other as a result.
Yeah, I don't have the rhetorical architecture yet, but to hear you tell it, one vastly simplistic understanding of Central Western dominant narratives, essentially one that is top down and nonetheless somewhat atomizing. What I hear you advocating for is a set of dominant narratives, or a set of at least shared narratives, maybe not dominant, that are bottom up and that are maybe from their origins more atomized, less centralized, but in their collection more collaborated, more coordinated, more knit together. At least that's the not yet picture that is being painted in my own brain.
That's beautifully put. Actually, that's a very powerful restatement. And maybe I could explain why that seems important. And that is, Americans were tied together by some pretty fundamental values as settlers, um, on finding a way on a harsh, what seemed to us a harsh new continent, um, winning our independence, and beginning to form a more perfect union, as the Declaration of Independence says. And some pretty deep values held us together. We got a lot of things wrong, which we could talk about, but there were some core values that ran through most of the history of American democracy. And, religion told that story. Even in the 1950s, there were descriptions of American religion that showed some shared values. Sort of the civic and the religious could be mutually supporting. We seem to have come to a crisis, and I'm afraid, and this needs to be said out loud, I think, that religion has played a role in that. That the dichotomies that we've seen in American politics in the last 4, 8, or 12 years, the growing dichotomies such that civic discourse seems to be breaking down. I think those of us who study and practice religion, including myself, have to take some responsibility for that. And if you view that as a crisis for democracy in American life, then you might well think that we need to find some way of approaching this religious question that's more inclusive and less built upon fundamental oppositions than we've been doing it. And I think what your statement and where I'm trying to go are allied in trying to get to that deeper level. Push the restart button, Jefferson. Maybe that's the way to say it.
So yeah, the phrase, my old line was, we did a few conferences around using the title was sort of rebooting democracy, and
Yeah.
the visual imagery was not merely a button. The visual imagery was actually a boot, because it was about actually what about walking around communities, knocking on doors, and talking to neighbors. The again, sort of head in the clouds, but feet rooted at least on the pavement. Uh, so say more about the central narratives, the role that religion plays, including Christian religion, including the traditions that I was raised in, and uh, how that feeds into an oppositional understanding of community. Right? I mean, I think because I will say where my mind started going to was a misunderstanding or an over-reliance on the fact that I have two arms, right? And the fact that kind of heaven and hell, Republican and Democrat. And that's not to say I don't have political values, or I think the answer tends to be somewhere in the middle betwixt extremes. That's not how I think the world works. But I think we are cabined in, I think we are trapped in a false understanding of duality. And I think it limits our collective thinking, our even shared consciousness. And then, before I get too woo-woo, let me shut up and hear from you. That's what I take from some of what I heard, but that's not necessarily what you said. When you said that religion feeds into potentially feeds into, or almost certainly feeds into an oppositional understanding of community, say more about that.
We paint it with really broad brushstrokes and actually paint two different paintings. And let me take my own tradition, the Christian tradition. There's one story that says that creation began in the broadest possible way. In the beginning, God created heaven. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then it got narrower and narrower until the point came where all history went through the funnel of Jesus Christ, and some went through and others were discarded, and then that moves to heaven or hell. So that the greatest point of constriction is the point of the yes or no about Jesus. And then the creeds that the church gave that gave the criteria for who is in and who is out. Nicene Creed in 325 and the rest of them all the way through. And as the denominations split, there's only one true way through. So if you're Catholic, the Reformation got it all wrong. If you're Protestant, we finally got rid of the Catholics, but then we splintered into so many denominations. We have over 2,200 Baptist denominations in the United States alone. So it's tinier and tinier hourglass that only a few, like the eye of the needle, only a few will pass through. Okay, new painting. Religion, the Christian religion began narrow, actually, because Judaism arose as a tribal religion, and Yahweh, Jehovah, was the God for Abraham and his offspring. And then it throughout the Old Testament, or what's called Hebrew Bible, it expanded wider and wider to include more, so that there could be non-Jews who could know and respond to God. Broadened out in lots of details, but we don't want to get too nerdy. Until you get
that's, by the way, you just violated the principle of the show. We can get nerdy wrong. We can go on nerd tangents that are not the best nerd focus, but I don't like to think we can get too nerdy, right?
All right. Well, I was thinking of Second Maccabees in the intertestamental period, so between the close of Hebrew Bible and the first scriptures written for the Christian New Testament, when there was a sense of a universal resurrection of all people. So in Second Maccabees 7, there's already the sense that that this way is broadening outward. You see that in many of the prophetic books of the later Hebrew Bible. Okay, but then on this story, Jesus isn't the most narrow point. Jesus is the one who says, summing up the entire law, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And Paul writes in Galatians, there's no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, but all are one. And Christ is understood as this sort of cosmic creation principle in the beginning of Colossians. Okay, end the nerd button. But the idea is that here you have a tribal religion now beginning to express the love of all. Faith, hope, love, these three abide, but the greatest of these is love. And that makes Christianity then an expansive, inclusive religion. That picture is the one that's motivating me when I speak in this discussion about a religion that is a source of openness and connection, not constriction and exclusion.
And I will say amen, and I'll apply to it a layer in our closing minutes of patriotism. That the story of the United States similarly has, I'm not prepared to call it an hourglass, but a constricting and expanding understanding of who it is, that does give us a chance, perhaps, to shift the narrative from a narrative of dominion, from a narrative of extraction and conquer, and in fact, defining those as virtues, and instead, or at least evolving towards virtues as something closer to nurture, virtues closer to openness, expansiveness, a definition of the American story as one of empowering many people rather than wielding power over more and more people. And that ultimately like why I am an optimistic patriot is the idea of crafting the American story in that way, right? Of a story as a story like the Jesus Christ story, as a story of redemption, that where we are redeeming ourselves from our sins of slavery, and I mean that not only as a white American but as a human being in this country, as our national sins of murder of Native peoples, that even our sins of misogyny, that the only justification for patriotism in my mind is the same as only justification for well, I don't want to say only, as to me the best justification for Christian faith, which is a story of redemption. So that's what I'll pile on.
But that's perfect, because the same two sketches that I imagine work for the history of American democracy.
Right.
On the one hand, a narrative that makes it more and more narrow, so that what I do in 2021 is to fight for me and people like me. And my role in democracy is to make sure that my folk get the best we can out of the system. But the vision of American democracy that moves me, that as I travel around the world brings tears to my eyes and pride, is an inclusive form of government where we celebrate the strengths of all the citizens. And that same expansive narrative, the way I remember walking in India, way back in villages far, by foot, hours from a car, where any car came, and people said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "America." And they said, "America, yes, go America." There was an excitement about that image of a place where we celebrate. We had a first Black president at that time. And that, for these dark-skinned people, was really an amazing moment. Imagine that we can reclaim, imagine the new possible, that we can reclaim that broad, expansive, inclusive notion of democracy. We build strong communities at the local level, and then broader communities upon that and upon that, so that Washington were the community of communities of American communities, representing the good of the whole range and diversity of our country.
I think there's a great place to almost stop, but let me say as we wrap, you're probably not going to answer which is your favorite essay. So which was your least favorite? No, the book is The New Possible, the foreword by Kim Stanley Robinson. Our guest today put it together, and so glad that you came together with us to talk about it. Is there an essay in there that you think people might miss if you don't plug it? You want to make sure they don't miss.
Yeah. So we had a beautiful piece from Associated Press on the book, and he said, you really should have ended the book with the essay by Jack Kornfield. He's a Buddhist teacher who's now working on a Buddhist economics in California somewhere, Bay Area. And his argument is that in this moment of pandemic, it's written sort of like a meditative chapter. It's one I'd really recommend picking up, and it reads too quickly. And he just says, stop. This is a chance that we don't need to rush. We don't need to do all the things we did before. You're on lockdown after all. So don't carry on this fruitless rushing around that you've been a part of your life for how many years of your adult life. Slow down, stop, smell the flowers, find yourself again. If you're frightened and afraid, acknowledge that. If you feel isolated, find ways to connect. And then make a resolve that this ability you've just taken to stop and breathe again, that you don't lose that. That coming out of this period, as we begin to get vaccinated, we've got great news in Oregon about availability of vaccines, a lot of optimism in the last week or so. As that begins to happen, don't lose this moment. When the skies were more blue, it seemed like the birds were singing more loudly. People were walking on bicycles in front of our houses. And we had a sense that we didn't have to live our whole life in that darkness and that selfishness and that isolatedness that can be so much a part of our existence. And that we can begin to say, now, let's keep living this way. Let's find some ways to continue what we got right during the worst pandemic in a century. And I think that Jack Kornfield essay, especially those last few lines there where he sort of pulls it all together like a brilliant spiritual teacher. Whatever your religion, I think there's something powerful and alluring to that.
Philip Clayton, thanks for trying to help us remember not to stay in the darkness and to enjoy the sunshine and provide a little bit of light here. Appreciate your work, and thanks for spending some time.
Thanks, Jefferson, for having me. Take care.
Be well. Really enjoyed this.